The title of my talk is 10 Lessons from 10 Years Building 10 Free-to-Play Games. I'm working now as an independent consultant. But 10 years? Have you really been doing free-to-play for 10 years? I actually kind of went through my head and kind of thought back in time because it was such a neat title that I had to try and work out if it was the case. Well, between 1999 and 2004, I was working in the traditional games industry. I started working QA at Acclaim, remember those guys? And then I worked for another small company and then went over to Lionhead for a few years. I actually went through some old photographs from my old cell phone. And on May the 12th, 2004, so exactly 10 years to the day of me creating this presentation, I was working on this thing. These are photographs I took with my Nokia, remember Nokia? My Nokia cell phone when I was working at Sony. And this was actually the beginnings of a prototype for a product which was to be called the Getaway Online. So that was an online version of the Getaway for the PlayStation 2, which I was working on as a designer. And that project, over the course of several years, morphed into my first free-to-play project, which was PlayStation Home. So I actually worked on PlayStation Home between 2004 and 2006, and for a while I was the lead on that project, and actually was the person who got the game greenlit. And I am also, I'm ashamed to say, responsible for the rather anodyne, kind of scary, dystopian look of the product. I then moved over to EA. The first project I worked with at DICE, which is the EA studio I was working on, was Battlefield Online. Not many people know about this game, but this was a specific version of Battlefield 2 created for the Korean market. And we did this in partnership with a company called NeoWiz, which EA did several free-to-play games which were launched in Korea with. So my learning about free-to-play didn't come from a particularly usual source. I actually went to Seoul and I sat down in a boardroom with some of the key people at NeoWiz and learned about free-to-play the Korean way. It's fascinating in those days to go to a PC bang, these PC cafes, and kind of see the room suddenly filled with schoolboys all in uniform at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they all sat down and started playing games. So that for me was free-to-play for a long time. We then took the learnings from Battlefield Online and we built a game called Battlefield Heroes, which came out in the Western world in 2009, and I was the lead on that project, a PC client game, really taking a Korean-style monetization model and bringing it over to the Western world. We then spun out that particular team working on Battlefield Heroes into a business unit within EA, a studio within EA, and actually the first non-acquired specialist studio within EA making free-to-play games. And we started to publish games from other studios, and the first one we worked on kind of in partnership with another studio was Battleforge, which was a failed packaged goods game which was then converted to free-to-play. And this was actually a card battle MOBA, which was launched in 2009. So we were like 5 years too early, I think, with that, because I think a card battle MOBA would be like the most fashionable game you could release on PC at the moment. We then created a game with that same studio called Lord of Ultima. This was my fifth free-to-play game. Lord of Ultima was very much from that lineage of German strategy games. And people think of Clash of Clans as being a relatively new concept. But Clash of Clans comes from a very long lineage of German browser-based free-to-play strategy games, of which Lord of Ultima was one. Game 6 was a reskin of Battlefield Heroes into realistic graphics using assets from previous Battlefield games. That was called Battlefield Play for Free. And then I worked briefly on another browser-based strategy game in the Command & Conquer universe built by that same studio. Game 8 was my first mobile title, which was created with my studio, which I founded with the guys at DNA and NG Moko, a game called The Drowning, which was released last year on iOS. Game 9 was a title which came out in December of last year called Lawless on iOS, which was, I think, top 5 or top 10 in most territories on the free download charts. And just in April, we released the 10th game that I've worked on, free-to-play game that I've worked on, which is called Isolani, which is a core gamer-focused, story-based free-to-play shooter on iOS, which was heavily featured by Apple, and we were really happy with the performance. So let's start with these lessons. You're a pretty knowledgeable audience, but I'm taking a step back here and trying to think about the big lessons that I've learned over the years. Some of these will be obvious to you, but let's step through them anyway. The first most important lesson I've learned over the years is that fun is far more important than monetization. And this conference is called Game Monetization, but in my mind, concentrating on entertainment is far more important. And the reason for that is because retention equals monetization. Those two things are directly connected. And what I mean there is it's very, very easy to increase the monetization for a game, irrespective of your retention. Putting mechanics in there and items in there to increase either your conversion rate or the spending for the spenders is pretty damn easy in my experience. But it's almost impossible to increase your retention in my experience. And I think this is why the big players, particularly in the mobile space, will kill games if they don't hit certain retention numbers in soft launch, because they know that you can only add 2 to 3% to your retention figures. So retention has to be what you concentrate on. And I believe from my experience that retention really comes, the strongest retention will come from creating fun gameplay or compelling gameplay. So what we're trying to do is get people to come back to your game another day or another week, and there's two things that are going to compel them to do that. One is, I enjoy playing that game, it makes me feel good, I'm going to go and play it again. And the other one would be, there's something to do in that game that I'm stressed about, and I want to launch that game again. These two elements, which have been in key components in the history of games, are just as important nowadays as they've ever been. I don't believe that cheat mechanics work. You will often see things like daily rewards in free-to-play games. These are generally done to top up the retention of a game which is already retaining well. You can't take a game which is performing badly, that people aren't enjoying, that people aren't coming back to, and plaster cheat mechanics on top of it and try and make a successful product. In my experience, that doesn't work. Lesson number 2. It's so bloody hard to make free-to-play games if we compare it to normal games. I look back on my days creating and working on traditional games with kind of rose-tinted spectacles maybe, but it seemed incredibly easy. We simply made a fun game which appealed to the audience that we wanted to buy the product, and that was a completely self-contained client sitting on a disk or as a digital download, and you simply release it. And this is incredibly simple if we compare to what we have to do in free-to-play. In free-to-play, you've got to do that whole thing there, create a fun game, and then you've got to create a game design within that which retains users. It has to be almost endless in terms of the amount of time that you can put into the product, and it has to monetize them. So these are enormous additional chunks of work that you've got to create on top of just making a fun game or a compelling game. Then you've got to build a game backend, and let's not mess around. The whole reason for game backends in free-to-play is they're DRM, essentially. We are making sure that we control fraud and cheating within our product. And we don't have DRM on our disks to prevent fraud. We have backends which make sure that all of the transactions and behavior in the game are responsible. You've got to build a store. You've got to become an expert in stores and in merchandising and in pricing, which is a whole other set of skills and probably a set of people working for your team. On some platforms, you have to spend a lot of money building a website, creating a registration flow on that website, integrating payment instruments, doing business development on payment instruments. So it's really, I think you kind of get used to this work, but when you compare and think back to what it's like working on traditional games, there's just a vast amount of money and time you have to spend even getting a free-to-play game launched. And then, of course, you've got to do the analytics side of things. Build an analytics backend and hire an analyst, which leads on to the culmination of all of these skills and abilities and technology that you build together. Then you've got to run that as a live service. The analogy I used to make when I was at EA, when I was trying to explain this process, was that in the traditional games business, you build the hotel, and in the free-to-play business, you build the hotel and then you run it forever. And those are two very different approaches to work, I think. So lesson 3, then, is a little bit like that old adage about property. What are the 3 most important things? Analytics, analytics, and analytics. What I mean here, really, is the incredible importance of this capability within your team. I'm talking to teams at the moment as I step into my consultancy role who have launched games and have spent more than $5 million on their products, but they don't really have a fully featured analytics system or an analyst on their team, which is a kind of a terrifying thing based on my experience. This is like taking your aircraft up above the cloud level, everyone's on board, you're pointing your plane at the right destination, and then you black out all of the windows and you turn all of your instrumentation off. That's essentially what these companies are doing. I think it's an important point to make that you shouldn't be driving your game design with analytics. That's not the purpose of analytics, and I think that's a misnomer in the industry that this emphasis on analytics drives your game design. On the contrary, what you're doing is you're using analytics to determine how your players are behaving. That's the simplest way of looking at it. So you open your hotel, and then you need to know where people are in the hotel. What rooms are they in? How much money are they spending? How busy is your bar? And without analytics, you don't know any of this stuff. I do believe that the coupling of a good game and turning that good game into a successful business, the key there is analytics. Without that, you just have to rely on luck. And, several times in my career, we've launched a good game which was promising, but it wasn't a great business until we started to dive into the data, make those necessary changes, and then it became profitable. Obviously, you've got to tune the product. One of the key uses for analytics, in my experience, is settling those controversial decisions in the team. You'll have two groups within the team, may have several ideas within the team on how to improve a particular metric. If you can do the work on those three metrics and then do a multivariate test on them, that can settle an argument. Obviously, you need to know what to sell. You need to know what's selling, and so you can sell more of it, what to build in terms of extra content, and then, of course, your pricing needs to be dealt with in a proper analytical process. Lesson 4. This is really important. Every genre which I've worked on has been completely different. And what I mean by this is free-to-play is sometimes considered a genre by people outside of the industry and sometimes within the industry, but free-to-play is a business model. It's not a genre. There are no tricks. And just as game design is different for each genre that we work on outside of the free-to-play business, the traditional gameplay part is different, but also the free-to-play part is different. Now, the rules of building a strategy game are very different from the rules of building a platform game and from building a driving game. And I believe that the rules of the free-to-play part of those games is just as different. In my experience, if you try to map a mechanic which works, for instance, regarding monetization or retention on genre A, you can't map it onto genre B. We've tried to do that. I've worked on products where we've tried to take a mechanic from a card battle game, which is 100% successful, and map that onto a different genre, and we haven't seen any correlation in the way that users behave based on those mechanics. So you really have to go into this, the idea of working on different genres with the same kind of clarity of purpose that you do when you're working on general game design. Lesson 5. This is an interesting one which I've discovered over the years. There's a kind of a received wisdom in free-to-play industry that accessibility is key, that you must always try and create an accessible game. But I believe that's only actually the case within certain genres. Looking at the games that I've worked on and other titles, I only actually think that accessibility is key within certain genres in the free-to-play space. And actually, the rule isn't free-to-play games need to be accessible. It's actually that casual and mainstream games need to be accessible. And nowadays, most of our casual and mainstream games are free-to-play. But we knew this anyway, right? PopCap were making $5 to $10 casual games back in the day, and they were very accessible. It's not necessarily a particularly interesting finding that your casual games for a casual audience need to be accessible. Not all free-to-play games are casual and mainstream nowadays. In fact, we've got some extremely successful free-to-play games out there which are deeply inaccessible. If you've ever tried to play League of Legends, you'll know what I mean. This is a game with an extraordinarily steep learning curve, where if you misbehave or don't play properly in your first few online matches, you will be bullied by the community. But this is an extraordinarily successful game. So it may well be, if you're producing a free-to-play game for a core audience, that you don't need to spend too much money and time making it as accessible as possible. And it's very easy to get sucked into a cycle of trying to improve the accessibility or the new user acquisition funnel within a game. It's actually much harder to focus on other things. Lesson number 6 then. It kind of leads on to what I was just saying. We have now got this tremendous diversity in the audience when it comes to free-to-play. And this business model is becoming wider and wider in terms of the genres which it's being applied to, the demographics which are engaging in it, and the platforms that it's available on. Now, this isn't an exaggeration. My daughter, who is 3.5 years old, she plays free-to-play games on her iPad. And my grandmother, who's nearly 90, she plays free-to-play games. She was a huge fan of Farmville. So literally the widest demographic spread that we can possibly have are engaging with free-to-play games. And of course, you can't apply the rules of one audience to another. So you have to take into account this diversity. It really makes things more complex and difficult than they first seem from the outside. Of course, whenever we're creating products, we take into account this kind of diversity. A product that you create for a 40-year-old woman is very different from a product that you would create for a 15-year-old boy. So it's very important to take into account not just your free-to-play business, but the specific demographic that you're targeting and how you may address that demographic's needs. Obviously, like I say, all products take into account demographic diversity, and free-to-play games are no different in this sense. Lesson number 7. All platforms are unique. I've worked across the major platforms for free-to-play games, and there's lots of specifics which are very important. When you do a PC client free-to-play game, there's an enormous amount of time and effort that you need to spend building a website for that product to market it. You need to create a back-end which includes a CDN, a content delivery system of some kind, because those bits and bytes need to be sent to the consumer. You have to manually integrate payment instruments in a lot of instances when you're creating a free-to-play game which is PC client. In my experience, acquiring users on PC client games, if that's for a core audience, is so much easier than it is on mobile. With a few well-placed pieces of publicity, articles, a bit of buzz within the community, and some social media presence, you can acquire users at a pretty significant rate. And there's no real idea of a notion of a feature on the PC. There's no front end for the PC, despite the attempts for Valve and Microsoft, indeed, with Windows 8 to do so. There still isn't really a specific magic bullet front end for PC client. On mobile, things can be a little bit simpler in some sense. So you've got this integrated payment system, and they deal with fraud and refunds on the payment side. Or within the App Store, so that's pretty good. You've got to pay a very small fee to become a free-to-play or a developer on mobile, and then obviously there's the rev share that you have with the platform. There's no need for that for the CDN side of things. That's dealt with within the App Store. There's a kind of a standardized screenshot and metadata system on mobile, which just makes some aspects of it much easier. But as has been one of the themes of the sessions today, acquiring users on mobile is exceptionally hard, and being featured is incredibly powerful. We've done some research over the years, and we've been able to put the value on an editor's choice. So a global editor's choice on iOS is probably worth between $2 and $4 million. So that there are key people in Apple around the world, maybe between 10 and 20 people who make these decisions, who are on a weekly or a bi-weekly basis giving $2 to $4 million free marketing gifts to developers. So this is an extraordinarily powerful mechanism. When we look at browser, it's a bit like a PC client, but you don't need to worry about the large files. You don't need to worry about the drop-off in downloading a large PC client. Console is interesting. I never launched a free-to-play game on console, but I now know people who are doing some free-to-play products on console, and it seems to be a little bit of a hybrid of mobile. You have the ease of setup of your store, etc., your metadata, your CDN, like you do on mobile, but you have also have the ease of acquisition of users as you do on PC client, because it's a relatively smaller audience, and those people are actively engaged in social media and specialist press as well. The downside, of course, on console is the very, very small addressable market at the moment. Lesson number 8. The only thing that's really constant within the free-to-play industry, in my experience, is change. And it's worth stepping through the phases that I've experienced over the years. In the early 2000s, it was really only a model which was successful in Korea and was very much associated with that country. And primarily the genres that it was working on were MMOs. By the mid-2000s, we started to have smaller companies in the West focusing on free-to-play, some in the US and some in Europe, and they tended to focus on PC client and very low-res browser games. So we had companies like Gameforge with Metin and O-Game, and Three Rings with Puzzle Pirates, and the teams building products like Travian, which were very much beginning as cottage industries. But I think for most people, free-to-play became a big business model in the late 2000s with the growth of the Vil games from Zynga on Facebook. And they just, the whole model became absolutely huge at that point. So we've already, within under 10 years, we've seen 3 specific phases in the free-to-play business. PC client became big at the same time, with games like Combat Arms being launched and League of Legends beginning to grow to the multiple millions in monthly revenue. And then we saw this very interesting switch during these two years. And I think there's kind of a received wisdom in the industry that Facebook gaming failed. And I don't really see any evidence of that. Certainly the audience for gaming on Facebook declined to a degree. But what I actually saw was the Facebook consumers just simply moving over to mobile devices. Rather than consuming Facebook on a PC desktop, they're spending much more of their time consuming it on mobile devices. And that just means that their gaming also moved to the mobile device as well. This idea that over-monetization or a specific game design was putting people off playing Facebook games, I see no evidence for it. And the reason for that is, look at the 3 top grossing games on mobile last year. In the Western world, we've got Candy Crush Saga, which is a Facebook game, right? The exact same game is available on Facebook. We've got Heyday, which is a much polished and improved version of a Facebook game, Farmville. And we've got Clash of Clans, which is a much improved and polished version of a Facebook game, Backyard Monsters. So we haven't seen any evidence at all that the types of game designs and the types of monetization mechanics on Facebook weren't appealing to consumers. All I saw was those consumers move from playing their games on the PC to playing them on their mobile device. And I saw this in my family. My mother plays Candy Crush on her phone. She doesn't play Farmville on her laptop anymore. And then, of course, over the last couple of years, we've seen this tremendous growth in mobile gaming. Huge change just over the course of 5 or 6 years. And I think that there's a really important learning from this that I've kind of seen over the years, and that's that bandwagon jumping is basically impossible because of this speed of motion. The fast follow strategy doesn't work because the industry is moving faster than you can follow, to be honest. So I think as a free-to-play developer, you need to pick a platform and genre that you're comfortable with and that you're excited about, and you can't just follow the crowd. There are basic things that you need to do to create a successful product, but bandwagon jumping isn't one of them, I don't believe. Lesson number 9. This is really just the beginning. And I want to sort of talk about the growth in revenue that I've seen over my career in free-to-play. I can remember in 2010 that making $50,000 to $100,000 a day was amazing business for a single game. It was really exciting. And when you started to hit those numbers back in those days, then you had a great business. And then in 2012, we started to get games like CSR Racing coming out, which were hitting the hundreds of thousands of dollars a day. The low to mid hundreds and thousands of dollars a day. And again, there was news stories everywhere. You can still look them up. The news stories kind of aghast at the revenue that CSR Racing was doing as a top grosser on iOS during that period. Now, I can remember during this period, in fact, it was in 2011, I did my interview with NG Moko with Clive Downey, who is now the COO at Zynga. And he said to me in his he's a British guy, but he has this Silicon Valley mindset of thinking really big. He said, I want to be building games that make $1 million a day. And he was saying this in a kind of a extremely aspirational, unrealistic fashion, as those guys do, as is the culture in Silicon Valley. And I can remember thinking, $1 million a day? Are you joking? This is ridiculous. And now, of course, we are in this era. Just a year and a half later, 2 years later, we entered this era of $1 million a day products and $1 billion lifetime games. I once had a conversation with one of the biggest and most successful developers in the traditional games industry who said, point me to a $1 billion free-to-play game and I'll start to take the platform seriously or the business model seriously. And we're in that era now in the Western world. And we see this this chart. So watch Apple at the Worldwide Developers Conference next month, and they'll probably report the revenue growth for the App Store. The App Store has been doubling every year for several years now, and it may not have quite that same rate of growth, but I think it's going to continue to grow extremely rapidly. So the next phase that we're in, and we're just talking about 6 or 7 years probably process, will be multi-million-dollar daily revenues and multi-billion-dollar lifetime revenues. An enormously fast growth. Which kind of brings me to lesson 10, which is that we, as successful free-to-play developers or people moving into this space, you need to be incredibly paranoid about the next phase. And there's a great history within the digital games business of companies being tripped up by this constant change and revolution. So there were a whole bunch of Western free-to-play games that focused on destination browser sites, browser-based free-to-play games that were sat in a destination website. And those companies definitely saw stalled growth over the last 3 or 4 years as mobile took over. We saw lots of Facebook companies, Zynga being one of them, missing the transition to mobile somehow, being so focused on the rapid growth of Facebook that they weren't realizing or able to react quick enough to the fact that the audience was transitioning over to mobile. So they needed to have been more paranoid about new platforms. This is something which people don't often talk about. Microsoft were the first company that had an app store, in the sense that we recognize it. They had a digital hardware platform where you could download games and pay for them. Xbox Live Arcade was a tremendous opportunity for them, and I believe that a lack of vision at Microsoft and I guess being tied to the retail model meant that they missed a really big opportunity there to be the first platform that was really delivering a huge amount of digital content. Here's another one. People think of Apple as a phone company now, but the idea of Apple creating a phone is just as crazy as the idea of Nintendo making a phone. When you read the stories of the development of the iPhone at Apple, there was tremendous nervousness and concern and struggles within the company to start moving into small handheld devices with wireless technology in them. And actually, I believe that the only other company that was better placed to kind of create this disruption, rather than a traditional phone company, was actually Nintendo. So there is, a history of these of companies missing the boat, not being paranoid enough, and not thinking about what the next step is or phase is going to be. And most recently, we've seen companies which were really successful on mobile starting to miss a transition from premium to free-to-play on the mobile platform. Let's not forget that Rovio were the top-grossing games companies just a couple of years ago, and now they're far from it. Other companies within that space have taken that mantle, and really that should have been Rovio. They had the momentum, and they missed that transition to free-to-play. So what is going to happen next? I'll just get out my crystal ball and try and make some guesses. I think we're going to rapidly get into the point where success on mobile at scale, I'm not talking about a profitable business for an indie company, I'm talking about creating a new Supercell or creating a new King, is going to be impossible for all but the biggest and most well-funded companies. So maybe if you're out there and you've got a tremendous game idea and you're backed up with over $10 million probably, maybe you can start to make a dent in mobile. But I think it's going to be extremely difficult for us to have bootstrap startups have the level of success that we've seen of other companies. And let's not forget that Supercell and King have been doing this for 10 years anyway, and it was just another platform transition for them. Supercell, the key people within that company, have been creating mobile games way before they were sexy and fashionable. If you look at the history of computing, we're definitely on a course where devices are getting smaller and they're getting closer to our bodies, more intimate. And it's not really until you take a long look at the industry from mainframes all the way to iPhones that you start to see a potential transition to even smaller devices which are even more intimate and even more accessible to you. And there's lots of buzz in the industry about wearables. I don't think we know necessarily which type of wearable is going to be the most successful, whether it's one that's mounted on your wrist or one that's mounted next to your eyes. But I'm pretty convinced that the next step, the big computing device, is going to be something smaller and more intimate. And there's another kind of thing to think about. I'm perfectly happy for free-to-play to die as a business model because I'm not necessarily intrinsically interested in free-to-play. I'm just interested in what's the next thing. And I think there's two possible business models which could disrupt free-to-play as we understand it now. That would be a free download, which is then monetized by virtual goods sold within the game. The first is advertising-supported games. Now, as the audience for gaming gets big enough, and as we start to see the smartphone basically take over the feature phone in terms of worldwide ownership, people in Africa, people in India, people in Bangladesh, and increasing penetration into China, we're going to have to start to have a very good, viable global advertising platform within gaming, which could give you enough revenue to fund significant products. So I believe that some kind of advertising support from third parties, whether it's deeply integrated or simply banner ads, could be the next thing that disrupts free-to-play. And why would it disrupt free-to-play? Because there is an intrinsic churn in a free-to-play game which is pushing you to spend over time. And a game which contains no pressure of that type, aside from viewing ads, is likely to retain users for longer. So another free-to-play business model, or another business model which is cheaper than free-to-play, is another possibility that comes about by having a very wide audience, and that's selling ancillary items outside of the game world. So let's think about Star Wars as an IP. Imagine a free-to-play game on a mobile device or on a PC which is as cool, as exciting, and as long-lived an IP as Star Wars, but it's completely free. It's giving you free content all the time, but it's selling stuff outside of the game world. And we're starting to see this a little bit with things like Skylanders. Selling figurines, selling T-shirts. Rovio do a good job of this. I believe that as the audience gets bigger and as the potential wins there are large enough, there will probably be a company out there who invests a significant amount of money in a completely free experience aimed entirely at engaging users and then creating a world which is interesting and exciting enough to sell these ancillary items on top. If we look at what Lego are doing on mobile, it's something very, very close to that. My 3.5-year-old plays a game on her iPad where you construct cakes and sandwiches and ice creams using Duplo sets. And it's a completely free game. There's no monetization within the app. We were in the toy store and she saw the products relating to this, the physical products related to this. She recognized them and she wanted them. So that kind of flow through recognizing and getting and falling in love with an IP through playing a game and then having opportunities to buy physical goods or other types of products outside of that, I think is a huge opportunity. So those are my 10 lessons. Maybe you've got some lessons that you want to share, and then I've certainly got some time for questions if there are any.
I've got a question.
Okay.
I think the disruptive change element is fascinating, and the idea that incumbents in any industry can end up having their entire lunch eaten by other people who are coming along. But one of the things I think that makes it really interesting is those incumbent companies are full of bright, smart people who have got access to all the research, and yet it still happens. And why is it that you can have bright, smart, well-paid people who read the same reports, and yet time and time and time again, they just end up losing their business? And one of the things, one of the things I wrote down was about the paranoia. It seems like being paranoid isn't actually enough. Is there a way in which these businesses can survive, or in actual fact, are you just doomed when disruptive technology comes along?
Yeah, I mean, the concept of disruption is an actual academic, idea created by Clayton Christensen at the Harvard Business School in the 90s. And generally, when he makes observations of companies which are in this state of kind of, I'm an incumbent, we were disruptive once, we made a lot of money, we became successful, we're now an incumbent, and there's these other things happening that we know about. You're right, that generally the CEOs or, the senior management or the guys on the ground can see this change happening and know exactly what the company needs to do. But Christensen describes an economic trap that you get caught in, especially if you're a public company. It's very difficult for a public company to say, we're not going to do any more Call of Duty games on discs because we see that market being threatened by free-to-play. We're actually going to put all of those resources into an unproven business model. You're really putting your stock price at risk. And if it's not your stock price, it's obviously your private investors that are going to be pretty unhappy with that. So, it's relying on a revenue stream from your incumbent business and not being able to allocate enough of those resources, people and money, into the thing which you've got to do. And there's only really a few companies in the world that have ever been able to survive that kind of change. IBM somehow, either they got lucky, or there's no singular individual at IBM, but they have weathered the storm over decades. And the other, of course, is Apple, but they were run by a singular individual who had enough power and chutzpah to basically just say, I don't care about the iPod anymore. We're gonna kill the iPod. We're gonna put the money into the iPhone instead. So it's a difficult one. Christensen has numerous techniques. He doesn't recommend trying to force it through within the same organization. Christensen will recommend dividing the company off and creating a spin-off company which has a completely self-contained P&L, which then does the disruptive stuff.
Because that was going to be my next question is, even though there was disruption, the companies you mentioned, they were often founded by people who were experts within the industry already.
Yeah.
And so in actual fact, the losers appear to be the stockholders and the people who had bought in at very inflated values in company X, to then find these sort of bright sparks leaving and then setting up. So even though there's disruption, there are some stakeholders who are benefiting in these companies being formed.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, well, on that note, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're moving into a panel. Thank you.